I've shared this story before with some of you, but on a pilgrimage to Italy, I had a unique experience of visiting the Basilica of St. Paul in Rome. Have any of you been there before? It's really beautiful. It has alabaster windows, and it's just lovely. And it's where the remains of St. Paul are in this ornate casket or a sarcophagus that's on display for the public. So I kind of meandered over there. I remember saying, Paul, what is up with you? These lectures on women, their public behaviors, whom we can have sex with. You're a little hung up on these issues, I think. And you're causing women in particular a lot of shame. To which Paul had no comment. I gave you a copy of chapter 7 because I wanted you to see the whole context for that passage. Because I can guarantee you that there are going to be some homilies today that are going to suggest that what we read is all of it. The paragraph that is bolded is what's for today. The paragraph above was what was the section that the bishops assigned for us to read last week. It's a little bit confusing. Last week, Paul was advising us that if we are married, we should live as if we aren't. If we're happy, if we purchase things, to live as if it isn't so, to let go of attachments. Here he's saying, remain as you are. I can hear a traditional male priest somewhere today touting the verses for this week as the reason for mandatory celibate life for all priests. Live with undivided devotion to the Lord. A wife and a family would only distract one from being concerned about the Lord's affairs, as if Peter himself was not married and had a family. Many of the apostles were. When we look at the full chapter, though, written to the community in Corinth, we see that Paul is answering questions that they asked him, members of the community in Corinth, about stress in their marriages and their private life situations. Beyond sex, they're asking if they should be married or remain single, get divorced or remain married, get circumcised or remain uncircumcised, accept freedom from servitude or remain as bondservants. These writings are a little like an advice column of Dear Paul rather than Dear Abby as the advice giver. Consistently, Paul is saying, reduce your anxieties. Don't let it trouble you. In this present crisis, remain as you are. There are more pressing concerns. So although Paul is a little all over the place, the key is in his perception of this present crisis. Paul is in an eschatological frame of mind. That's a big word you learn so. Eschatological means the end times, right? So remember last week he said, for this world in its present form is passing away. That's where his mindset was. He's in a state of panic, trying to help these believers prepare themselves for pending doom, for the death, the judgment, and final destiny of the soul of humankind. In our first reading, we see Moses directing the Hebrews in a similar way. The Hebrew people were about to cross over into the Promised Land, a land that Moses himself was forbidden to enter. Establishing the roles of priests and prophets and giving instructions for how those priests and prophets would be provided for, and how they would support each other and meet the spiritual needs of God's people. I asked Susan Negley to share with me a story of a period during her years in East Africa, where she had to leave and establish herself in a new place. Susan sent me this lovely story. It sounded like a letter to her parents, and she said, actually, my parents saved every letter, and it was in reading those that I wrote this story. She told me of a time when she and others lived in Torit, which is in South Sudan, establishing a base of operations for Susan and her compadres meant identifying a population that was underserved and required a doctor, finding shelter, food, and other provisions, learning the language, and keeping abreast of warring parties in order to remain safe. Taking only their essential and most meaningful possessions, they would pack up a vehicle and then travel to another compound when rebel troops were near. In one case, she stated that she and her friend had traveled to the Lower Parish, which was a 4-hour drive from Torrid. This was the parish where the bishop had originally wanted them to stay. But a bomb hit the house that she was assigned to live in. During that visit to the Lower Parish, 2 MiG fighters flew overhead, dropping bombs thankfully a distance away from their immediate vicinity. This was the sort of urgency that Moses and Paul were operating under. We talked last week about the need to adapt to changing circumstances. Moses was coming out of 40 years of wandering in the desert, hoping to finally direct God's chosen people to a place of peace and prosperity. And Paul was hoping to usher the early church into the end times. For both, letting go of attachment to what they had known was essential. Where Susan had to decide at a moment's notice what to put into a Jeep and what to leave behind, those in Corinth had to let go of attachments to their loved ones, their stations in life, their traditions and habits. The Hebrew people in Deuteronomy needed to accept a new structure in community life. Their leader for the past 40 years would be leaving them. Moses would die at 120 years old, and JP chuckles at this because it said, and his eyes were good and he still had good energy. So he died in the valley of Moab. God would send him a prophet. And just as Susan listened to the marching orders of her bishop, the guidance of area priests, and the wisdom of local Sudanese, it was time for God's people to listen to their prophet and create a plan. We've also been talking about this prophetic personality, or the gift of prophecy, as the Bible calls it. We see in Moses and in Jesus the embodiment of both priest and prophet. Both shepherded their people, established and maintained traditions, and were critical of those who were deceitful or hypocritical. Richard Rohr confirmed in a commentary he wrote on this week's readings that Moses was establishing roles for priests and prophets, and that both are essential to the health of the church. A priest is to keep the traditions, while a prophet challenges the status quo. Prophets are critical of the very systems that priests work to maintain. When you have both working in tandem, you have a system that is consistently refining itself from within. And you have an intelligent form of faith practice. Jesus and Moses possessed both qualities. This is evident in their care for those they shepherded and in their abilities to hear from God and to proclaim truth. In the Gospel of Mark, we see the first exorcism, or recognition of a dark spirit. Not in an expected place. Not in the body of a prostitute or a tax collector. Not in some back alley, but in a temple. The devil was in the church. As Richard Rohr says, the only way evil can succeed is to disguise itself as good. And one of the best disguises for evil is in religion. We don't know much about this man who was burdened by darkness, other than that he was a part of temple life. Notice that it was the man who was not forced to leave. He was cared for. Jesus did not condemn the person who was possessed. Jesus condemned the energy that inhabited him. People, we are called to see the pain that we each carry, our darker selves, and to, through love, pray for relief from that negative energy, calling out instead our better selves, loving one another, remaining, if we can, as a part of one family in God. Jesus, in calling out evil, was recognized for holding a certain confidence that comes from being grounded in God and in his identity in God, which the evil spirit recognized. Moses had the authority that came not just from God, but from 40 years of leadership. Jesus taught with a new authority, and not as the scribes, according to the gospel. He held no official role in the temple. He had no specific training, no scholarly background, and yet he spoke from a place of wisdom, a place of deep awareness and grounding in his relationship with God the Father. In a book on discernment, authors Dickman, Garvin, and Liebert say that the first component concerns listening to oneself, distinguishing the wisdom of the deepest self from all the other voices, and learning to trust this deep inner wisdom. The one estranged from her own wisdom will have a difficult time with discernment. In this sense, identity and discernment act as partners, each reinforcing and clarifying the other. That's that tension. And so with all the religious leaders in that room, it was Jesus who recognized the presence of evil, and the evil spirit understood Jesus' identity as a son of God, suspecting that then they were about to be destroyed. In the book of Deuteronomy, God says he will raise up one among God's people. The prophet will be one of them. Not someone born to the Levitical line or trained in the temple. Someone who listens to the Spirit of God and speaks from his or her own experiences. Previously, the way in which someone spoke with authority was to quote from the past, from the law, from previous opinions of great leaders, from Scripture, the Torah, the Catechism, the doctrine of faith. Jesus was a carpenter from Nazareth. Could anything good come from Nazareth? And yet when he spoke with the authority of a heart for God and a life lived engaging those on the margins of life. Paul, too, consistently said, look, this is just me, but in my experience. Susan Negley can talk to us about surviving in extreme adversity, about being quick and nimble in changing times. Your experiences matter. Your voice matters. Jesus was a layperson, not a cleric. How can we too honor our traditions but speak our truth? Being prophets or priests won't make us popular. They crucified Jesus. But these are essential roles in every healthy community that strives to refine itself.